I would like to introduce Dr. Helen A. Regis. She is a cultural anthropologist at Louisiana State University. As series editor for the Neighborhood Story Project, which is an absolutely fantastic project in New Orleans, she has helped create a new canon of collaborative ethnography written by and for New Orleanians. She's written a series of articles on public space, policing, parades, race, heritage, festivity, and tourism. She's the co-author of Charitable Choices, Religion, Race, and Poverty in the Post-Welfare Era, and she has a forthcoming book, Bayou Harvest, Subsistence Practices in Coastal Louisiana. Her public scholarship includes Seventh Ward Speaks, Paseos por New Orleans, and Creating Congo Square, Jazz Fest and Black Power. And as someone who's followed Dr. Regis's work for a long time, I would say that the public scholarship is just really, really interesting, involving a lot of photography and posters and people participating in creating exhibitions and so on that speak to their communities. So welcome, Helen. If you would like to start sharing your screen, we can move to your talk.
Thanks, Martha. Let's see if I can get that to show up for y'all. Is that showing okay?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. So the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival provides a rich site for exploring the anthropology of happiness in a racially polarized urban context. Pardon me while I set my timer. In this paper, I've been considering the question of cross-cultural commensurability of happiness and whether and how it is linked to virtue. In the 1970s, white festival founders saw the virtue in their work in giving respect to Black musicians whose art had been undervalued, centering local, authentic, African-American music and cultural traditions. In oral histories, these festival founders expressed their joy and happiness in creating integrated spaces for people to enjoy each other's music. And this was shortly after the desegregation ordinances were passed in New Orleans, which made the festival possible. African-American activists publicly contested this view, calling for accountability to the Black community whose cultural heritage the festival celebrated and sold. This paper explores divergent understandings of happiness and virtue through the lens of two figures whose extensive writings, oral histories, and interviews illuminate larger social fields. And they are festival founder Allison Miner and writer-activist Tom Dent. Now, in previous talks that I've given about this research over the last few years, I've focused on one of these figures or the other, and I've found it challenging to hold them together in one academic talk. And Martha has encouraged me to take on this challenge, so I'm very grateful to that. In this talk, I lean on both Tom Dent and Allison Miner as singular individuals, but also as members of collectives to which they belonged and which they in fact helped to create and organize around poetry readings, writing workshops, around theater making, festival making, and shared meals around the dinner table. So this was just a quick image from the 2019 festival, from their website actually, in which they were celebrating this anniversary. And while I talk about the festival in the present tense, as you can imagine, the festival has not taken place in the last couple of years. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there, but nonetheless, I'll continue to use the present tense since that's easier and also feels a little bit more hopeful. So I'll begin with Allison Miner. Every year on September 23rd, members of the A Minor Social Aid and Pleasure Club gather on the shores of the lagoon in City Park in memory of their deceased friend, Allison Miner. Miner was a self-taught folklorist, an archivist, and a co-founder of the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, which has become one of the largest music festivals in the world, and which brings millions of dollars into the New Orleans economy. When she died in 1995, her life was celebrated through the performance of a traditional jazz funeral, which is, of course, an African-American tradition. And she was one of the first Jewish women to be so honored. Significantly, it was the very concept of the traditional New Orleans funeral which drew Allison to New Orleans in the first place. As she explains in her autobiographical film, actually made by Amy Nesbitt, she recalls seeing a television program in which Danny Barker, the New Orleans jazz musician, historian, and someone who's widely credited as an instigator of the brass band revival in the city, explained, and this is Barker, "In New Orleans, people cry when they enter the world and celebrate when they leave." This idea of a funeral as a celebration of getting released from life captured her imagination. Only 2 years earlier, she had held her 10-year-old brother in her arms as he died of leukemia, an experience that marked her deeply and made her feel that she was already an adult. In 1967, she left home and moved to New Orleans, arriving with $100 in her pocket, looking for, as she put it, real music. She took a job at Tulane University in the Jazz Archive and also at the Louisiana State Museum. She explains, "That became my learning ground. I didn't have money to go to college. I was on campus and of course, I read endlessly and kind of educated myself. I didn't know what it would have been like to have enough money to go to college. I just knew I needed to work." And it was at the Tulane Jazz Archives, working with jazz music historian Dick Allen, that she came to meet George Wein, a festival producer, founder of the Newport Jazz and Folk Festivals, who was looking to create a similar festival in New Orleans, but needed local and cheap labor to do the groundwork. Allison invited her then boyfriend, Quint Davis, along for the meeting, and the two, along with many others, became principal architects of the festival. Later on, Davis went on to become the director and executive producer of the festival as Wein retired, and Allison's life took a different turn. During the annual festival, and here's Miner and Davis from a still from the movie Reverence about her life. And here she is on an oral history stage, which she helped to found. And obviously that stage continues today. During the annual festival, she has her place among the ancestors in a memorial space within the fairgrounds, where her image stands in a colorful grove of memorial markers, and in the company of music greats such as James Booker and Professor Longhair. The oral history stage, which she created and that bears her name and her photograph that hangs above the banner. But her presence is really more palpable than that. Her name is constantly on the lips of those whose long association with the festival brought them closer to her. Her memory is continuously evoked there. She haunts the festival grounds. Here she's depicted on her memorial marker playing a triangle, which she was known to do in many parades. To many of her friends and admirers, Allison embodied the very spirit of the festival and represented its moral voice. In her work in creating the festival, and then throughout her career as a music producer and manager, she was an advocate for musicians, working to create more equitable situations where they would be treated with respect and dignity. Whereas many in the music industry sought them out as commodities, their music, Allison sought to treat the musicians themselves in their full humanity as persons. And of course, this is part of what motivated her to create the oral history stage at the festival. In the memory of many who knew her, Miner was an important critical voice at the festival. And she's remembered as having been in constant struggle with the corporate interests of the music industry and even within the festival itself. This is often expressed in stories which paint her as a David battling against a corporate Goliath, embodied in the figure of George Wein, the festival's executive producer for the first few decades. According to one colleague, she was kind of Quint Davis's conscience. I think that was her role. Indeed, for many of those who knew her, she's become a symbol of the very spirit of the festival that is now perceived as being endangered by its growing corporatization. I'm going to be talking about Professor Longhair, an important musician in the history of the festival. And there was a stage named after him, the Fest stage, which was renamed the Acura stage after the car manufacturer. And people, of course, also criticized the increasing price of admission, as well as the increasing difficulties for neighborhood residents whose traditional music is presented on stage, from being able to attend. They're often prevented from attending by the cost. So two of her most famous creations and legacies are the music heritage stage itself at the festival, where musicians could engage in conversation with their fans in an intimate and homey atmosphere, and the Jazz and Heritage Foundation archive, which began in the form of Allison's scrapbooks of press clippings, and in which hundreds of tapes of musicians' interviews and performances are housed, a significant and growing archive of American music and culture. And I should mention that the archive also has archive fellowships, which a number of scholars have applied to and benefited from for doing research in New Orleans culture, including myself. Perhaps her most significant legacy, however, was the creation of a nonprofit foundation which would ensure that the profits of the Jazz Fest would remain in New Orleans and be channeled into the community that produced the music and cultural traditions featured at the festival. In one telling of its origins, Allison and festival producer George Wein physically wrestled over the checkbook in the culmination of a heated discussion about the festival proceeds. And this occurred several years after the festival's founding, when the festival in the mid to late 70s was just beginning to make a profit. So Allison prevailed and the foundation was created. The money would stay in New Orleans, where it would be reinvested into the community. So by the 1980s and the 1990s, the nonprofit Jazz and Heritage Foundation developed a strong identity as a Black-led organization and sponsored a series of community-based events, operated a seed grant program for emergent businesses and nonprofits, funded research on New Orleans music and culture, and contributed to a musician's health clinic. And there she is again with her son, and here's an image of Professor Longhair. Now, one of the stories that's told about her is, and perhaps one of the greatest contradictions in her life's work, is it involves a story about a kind of theft. And this is what I refer to as the Professor Longhair myth. She's often credited as having had a very close relationship with the musician Professor Longhair, who had been one of the founders of R&B, and some would argue of rock and roll music, but who did not get credit, who didn't receive a penny of royalties for his most popular records, a familiar story for those of you who know the history of American popular music. The Longhair myth has an implicitly racialized dimension. Many claim that she, along with festival co-founder Quint Davis, took Longhair out of obscurity, that she saved him. And people actually use this language. And the agency in the narratives is attributed to the white people in the story, not to the musician himself or to other activists and producers. In all of these narratives, those who work, those who get things done, those who make things happen, in brief, those who act, are white. And here I'm generalizing from many years of conversations, ethnographic research, and oral history research among members of this community of memory at the festival. I once asked a friend of Allison's about this cultural myth directly. There's something about her being a young white woman and him being an older, impoverished Black musician. Is there a reason why we want to remember her as saving him? Is that saying something about our society? And his denial was really revealing. He said, I don't think she had any preconceived idea of doing anything. I don't think she sat around at night and said, this is the plan. I'm going to save Professor Longhair. I think that he showed up, she recognized something in him. She literally thought, this guy is a forgotten genius and someone's got to do something about it. And here I am, I'll do it. And he concluded by saying, there wasn't any other reason. So here's where I I reflect on the fact that in trying to reconstruct her life, and she died long before I started researching the festival, so I never met her, but I did a series of oral histories with people who knew her. I began to realize that this life history project around the life of Allison Miner could only be an ethnography of her social world, and specifically of the community of memory, which organized itself initially around her hospital room, and later around her funerals, her birthdays, and the festival itself. It's also a history about strange alliances that were formed between white hippie producers and Black performers. And of course, this connected to a much larger history of a racialized folk revival and jazz revival that happened in the United States. I want to actually switch this for now and go to just a quick overview. So the festival was founded in 1970, and by the late 70s, as it begins to turn a profit, the African American Jazz Festival Coalition organizes to protest, boycott, and disrupt the festival, arguing that if they continued to exclude Black vendors from their crafts marketplace, the festival would be boycotted. My knowledge of both the white festival producers and the Black activists and intellectuals who became their critics and adversaries, and later their colleagues, is based on, as I mentioned, archival research, ethnographic interviews, and festival ethnography. Oral histories make it clear that the joy and happiness for white progressively minded lovers of Black music and expressive cultures was linked to being able to create integrated spaces for people to enjoy each other's music. So integration itself was the good, right, that would inform a happiness grounded in those values. Joy came from a sense of pride in being part of a generation that was liberated from the legacies of Jim Crow segregation. And yet, while they were learning to produce a festival, their orientation to Black culture was primarily one of consumption. So this is a poster from the early festival, which took place in the place remembered as known as Congo Square, right outside the margins of the French Quarter. And this is a scene from the early festival after it moved out to a much larger space a couple of miles from there. And here's an early poster that shows that in the iconography of the festival, African-American performances and cultures, particularly those connected to Black second line parades, really became central symbols for the festival. And here again, the iconic logo actually for the festival is based on a stylized depiction of paraders who are, to anyone who's participated in New Orleans in these traditions, that people would recognize that as a distinctive African-American second line parade tradition. So for critics like Tom Dent, who I'm going to be focusing on today, and his colleagues, a joyful experience of Black music and culture was based on its being responsive to and expressive of Black experience. In the Black arts movement, let's see, I'm looking for a slide. The Black arts movement, the virtue in Black music and cultural expression was linked to its being self-determined. Thus, while they may have experienced joy and happiness at the festival, its power and integrity could be thought of as stemming from its capacity for raising political consciousness, for animating political action. And this is in fact how the African American Jazz Festival Coalition became so important. While the white festival workers were invested in a notion of joy or happiness that required ignoring conflict, or at least putting them on pause, that very orientation made it difficult for them to hear the critiques of Black activists. And here's just a newspaper clipping about this in the Louisiana Weekly, a Black-owned newspaper, and the Vous-Carré Courier, which covered these events extensively. It was an alternative news weekly in that era. So Sarah Ahmed has written about, writes that by refusing to go along with public displays of happiness, women, people of color, and immigrants can participate in the widening of horizons. In the same way, these coalition activists who confronted Jazz Fest in the 1970s threatened to spoil festival pleasures with their demands, and in so doing, they effectively broadened horizons for African Americans to pursue their self-determination by curating their own art, music, and livelihoods. So here's just a pull quote from a letter written to the board of the festival in 1978, and that was also sent to Mayor Moon Landrieu. It seems that some members of the Jazz and Heritage Festival feel that African American community should be thankful to sing, dance, play music, and drink Schlitz beer while economic profits are made at their expense. And you can see how dancing here is such an important trope, both for the joy and its critique that was made by the activists. The activists involved with the coalition drew on an emerging analysis of the post-civil rights era that economic development would not necessarily result from the franchise and from the desegregation of public spaces. This isn't to say that activists like Tom Dent didn't care about music, dance, or the possibility of joy, but their relationship to these pleasures were complicated. And of course, some of the social issues that they were deeply concerned about are very much those that Carol Graham was speaking about a few moments ago. Social inequality and the profound effects of that on people's ability to access well-being. All right. The African American activists who founded the coalition and were one of the things that they demanded was a Black-led and Black curated space within the festival in which they could determine the content of the African and African descended culture, and that space was known as Coindu. Notice that they also have a silhouette of dancers, but it's a distinctively African one. And here's Tom Dent reading poetry on stage at the festival in 1980 on the Coindu stage. Now, Tom, or I should call him Dent because I really didn't know him personally, was a founding member of the Umbra group in New York City, which is considered to be foundational to the Black arts movement. And he's also was a member and eventually became a directing manager of the Free Southern Theater. He founded a writing arm to the Free Southern Theater itself, which became known as eventually as Black Art South. He was a founder of the Congo Square Writers Union and a number of publications, including Nkombo. And many of his writings were recently collected in this book, edited by his longtime colleague and friend, Kalama Salam. Salam describes his friend as, quote, a combined modern day, culturally grounded, ethnocultural anthropologist facing his past as well as a public, intellectual, cultural activist confronting the present. Interestingly, Dent joined the board of the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival in 1978 and later went on to serve as its executive director in from 1987 to 1990. At the festival today, the Tom Dent Congo Square Lecture Series and Symposium is named after him. He started the Congo Square Symposium, but it was named after him posthumously. So I want to draw a little bit on his writing, and I'm going to check my time. Tom Dent wrestled with issues around the politics of joy and uneven access to the capacity to experience happiness in his writing. In an essay about the musical genius Professor Longhair and the forbidden pleasures of Rampart Street, Dent writes, when I was a youth, the underworld, the inner recesses of this Black nation was always colored by my family and teachers in dark and dangerous lives. Violence always lurked in that underground. Possibilities for personal and social advancement were nil. Mrs. B, the principal of our upwardly mobile Methodist colored high school, warned us in a voice drenched in acid, "Stay away from South Rampart Street or you'll end up there." But for figures like Longhair, the denizens of Rampart Street couldn't be erased. "In my dream life," writes Dent, "I became a boy whose parentage was undeterminable, who moved among the people as one of them, enjoying the music and the dance." He says, "Those not entrusted with the burdens of personal racial uplift sang, danced, dressed their fantasies, their imagined beings. They became captains of their own ship." I probably skipped the most important part of the quote when he talks about the apparent frivolity, right, of this kind of public enjoyment. And what we see in this writing is Tom Dent's privileged upbringing as the son of the president of Dillard University, and someone who was expected to become a leading Black professional member of the talented 10th. And here he fantasizes about being able to join in the life of Rampart Street, where Professor Longhair grew up and where he lived and performed. But Dent also worried about distortion and the distortion of the culture that happens when it is put in public display and within reach of the white gaze. He was troubled by seeing Black flambeau torch carriers during Carnival, and he saw those men as the living embodiments of the mammy dolls for sale in the shop windows of the French Quarter a few steps away. He asked, how did our dance, drumming, and music, traditions so deeply embedded in the mother culture, become distorted into a dance for spare coins? When he thought about the creation of an autonomous Black art space, Coindu, of which he was one of the architects, his mind turned back to the great clarinetist Sidney Bechet, who in his autobiography, Treat It Gentle, remembers his own grandfather, Omar, who danced in Congo Square. It is Bechet's celebration of Omar's inner freedom, even while in legal bondage, that fascinates me, his determination not to become other than himself. Memory was the key. Memory was invoked through dance, drumming, and music. And when Dent was executive director of the Jazz and Heritage Foundation, he was instrumental in renaming Coindu to Congo Square. Congo Square was both a historic space of relative freedom and autonomy within the confines of chattel, of a society that was organized around slavery, and also remembered as a space where Black religion, Black culture, and Black commerce could thrive on the margins of the settler city of New Orleans. All right, so in the few minutes that remain, I want to think a little bit more with you about both about archives and about dystopia. So, so much of my ethnographic research has taken place in the polyphony of festival space, but also in the quieter space of the archive. And it's really in the archive that I first learned about, through the press clipping books, learned about the 1978 boycott. And it's also where I learned about Allison Miner, since she was a founder of that archive. So flipping to that page. I'm interested in this piece and thinking about how archives, following Michel Rolfe Trouillot, as archives assemble. Their assembly work is not limited to a more or less passive act of forgetting. Rather, that it is an active step of production that prepares fact for historical intelligibility. And it is really through the archives that both Miner and Dent created that I've had an opportunity to see these really divergent visions of happiness within the festival, and to get some glimpses of how cultural artists and cultural makers and activists really struggled over these divergent visions of happiness and its relationship to the good. I've been thinking about the power of archives to act, to teach, and to draw one into relationships. What folklorist Solimar Otero has called the archive of conjure. Writing about her research with Ruth Landes, who was an anthropologist who worked in Brazil on candomblé, Otero writes, "An archive of conjure is the practice of investigative cohabitation, where a researcher becomes entangled with ancestral subjects by paying attention to previous researchers' archival scribblings and other notations. And in the same way as Otero, researching in Ruth Landes' archives to understand her growing knowledge of candomblé and her growing encounters with the spirit world, I have also worked both in the Tom Dent archives at the Amistad Research Center at Tulane and at the Jazz and Heritage Archives that Miner founded, to ask questions not only about how the archive was assembled and what was left out, but also about the spirits that, that reside there. I've been, in thinking about this material, I've been really inspired by Amanda Lucci's recent work, White Utopias, which looks at transformative festivals, primarily those that organized around spirituality. And you could argue that Jazz Fest is quite different in its relationship to the possibilities for utopia. But what they have in common is that Jazz Fest, like the mostly white festivals that Lucia looks at, are white dominant spaces, but that are organized around an attraction to the other. These festivals, she suggests, really rely on the openness to unexpected events, to suggestion and encounter, to flow and perforation. But she also, and here's a New Orleans musician talking about how some New Orleanians approach the festival as their religion. Going to Jazz Fest for them is like going to church. And so even for those who are, you know, spiritual but not religious, the festival can be a space for connecting to something greater. And Dr. Michael White, who's a traditional jazz musician, connects to that as well. But Lucia also engages with the work of Arun Saldana on white viscosity, which is this idea of spaces which become impermeable to non-white others. And it's precisely that white viscosity that I believe existed at the early Jazz Fest, which African-American activists who were involved in the coalition sought to transform. And here I am also inspired by Savannah Shangai's recent work, Progressive Dystopias, which is focused on anti-Blackness in schooling in San Francisco at a very progressive high school. And just to be brief, since I'm out of time, I just want to note that for Shangai, dystopia and utopia are a symbiotic dyad. So while dystopia can be a way of naming the problems, right, that writers, particularly in science fiction and in other genres, are concerned about, dystopia is also for Shangai a practice, a set of practices. She suggests utopia, dystopia, chaos. These are ways of imagining the future, but they're not just ways of imagining the future or the past. They're concrete practices through which actors seek to imagine their present and transform it into a possible future. For Shangai, the dystopian labors to make visible various breaking points and vulnerabilities of late liberalism. And it's precisely that kind of white liberalism that the festival has really struggled with for many years, and which activists and artists and musicians like Tom Dent and members of the African American Jazz Festival Coalition really fought to challenge and to transform. Tom Dent and Allison Miner were entangled in distinctive projects, with Tom almost singularly working towards freedom and self-determination through his art and through his organizing work. And with Allison, working to desegregate public spaces and public festivity, and in her later work, advocating for musicians in the face of an exploitative music industry. I've learned a great deal from both of them, from their archives and from the communities which they brought together and which continue to gather in their memory, both during the annual festival and outside of it. Both of these figures created spaces for conversation. They recorded oral histories that really valued the knowledges, insights, and experiences of artists and civil rights activists, building an infrastructure for practices of listening across difference. Whether at the Allison Miner stage or at the Tom Dent Congo Square Symposium, artists, writers, musicians, and others hold space for each other in conversations that often take place at the intersections of freedom dreams, Black art, and engaged practices of dystopia. In the end, I think both Tom and Allison found joy in their pursuit of the good and in their entanglements with others. And I really want to thank Martha Radice for drawing me into thinking about happiness, first as a co-conspirator and her own research on carnival, and then for encouraging me to consider it in my own work on festivity. Happiness is good to think with, even or perhaps especially in these troubled times. Thank you.